In the final months of 1942, the skies over Europe were a battleground. The Luftwaffe ruled the air, their Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf Fw 190s dominating Allied bombers and fighters. The Allies were struggling to gain a foothold in the air war. Bomber crews flew missions with heavy losses, often without proper fighter protection deep inside occupied territory. Then, a new American fighter arrived, one unlike anything the Germans had seen before. It had two long booms, twin engines, and a distinctive central cockpit pod. It was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. At first, Luftwaffe pilots did not know what to make of it. Some mistook the shape for a heavy bomber. Others assumed it would be slow and clumsy. They soon learned they were wrong. In its first missions over the Mediterranean and Western Europe, the P-38 shocked German pilots. It not only held its own in combat, it outran and outclimbed the Luftwaffe's best fighters. This marked a turning point in the fight for air superiority. The P-38 had been designed years earlier by Lockheed engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson. Its most striking feature was its twin-boom layout. Each boom housed an Allison V1710 engine equipped with a turbo-supercharger. These superchargers gave the Lightning exceptional performance at high altitude, where German fighters often operated. Unlike most single-engine fighters of the time, the P-38 could sustain power even above 20,000 feet, where thin air robbed other planes of speed and maneuverability. In level flight, it could reach speeds over 400 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest aircraft in the sky in 1942. Its firepower was also unique. Instead of guns mounted on the wings, the P-38 carried all its weapons in the nose. A 20mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns. This concentrated fire meant there was no need to adjust for converging gunfire. A Lightning pilot could aim directly at a target, and the rounds would strike exactly where the nose was pointed. This made it deadly in a head-on attack or when firing from a distance. Combined with its speed and climb rate, the Lightning gave American pilots a machine capable of matching, and sometimes exceeding, the performance of Germany's top fighters. The first real test came during missions over North Africa and the Mediterranean. In late 1942, as Allied forces pushed into Tunisia, P-38 squadrons were assigned to escort bombers and conduct long-range patrols. German pilots flying Bf 109s and Fw 190s were used to dictating the terms of engagement. They relied on their ability to climb above enemy formations, dive in for quick attacks, and escape at will. When they tried this against the P-38, they were stunned to find that the new American fighter could stay with them. During one mission near Tunisia, a group of P-38s spotted a formation of German fighters moving in for an ambush on Allied bombers. Instead of falling back, the Lightning pilots climbed to meet them. A Bf 109 dove away, expecting to leave its pursuer behind. The P-38 stayed locked on its tail, closing the gap with ease. The German pilot, realizing he could not escape, jettisoned his drop tank and attempted a desperate series of turns. The twin-boom fighter matched him move for move, finally opening fire and tearing the Messerschmitt apart with a burst of cannon and machine gun fire. This was not an isolated event. Reports soon spread through the Luftwaffe ranks about the new American fighter. German radio chatter captured during missions revealed confusion and alarm. Pilots warned each other to avoid engaging the P-38 unless they held a clear advantage. Many referred to it simply as the twin-tail devil. American pilots, at first cautious and unsure, quickly gained confidence. They had grown up hearing of the Luftwaffe's fearsome reputation and had expected a hard fight. The P-38 gave them a critical edge. It had long range, allowing them to escort bombers further into enemy territory than British Spitfires or early P-47 Thunderbolts. It was fast enough to catch German fighters trying to break off from combat. Its heavy nose-mounted weapons made it a devastating attacker against both air and ground targets. As more missions were flown, tactics evolved. P-38 units learned to climb above enemy formations and use diving attacks to strike first, mimicking the Luftwaffe's own earlier strategies. German pilots were forced to adapt. They began to use hit-and-run tactics, avoiding prolonged dogfights where the Lightning's speed and firepower gave it the upper hand. Even so, losses mounted, and the balance of power in the air began to shift. By early 1943, the Luftwaffe could no longer ignore the challenge posed by the Lightning. German intelligence analyzed downed P-38s, trying to understand their weaknesses. They experimented with new engine settings and climb techniques to counter the Lightning's high-altitude performance. Some units even considered deploying heavily armed FW-190s specifically to target the twin-engine fighters. Despite these efforts, the arrival of the P-38 marked a critical moment for the Allies. It gave bomber formations a fighting chance and boosted the morale of aircrews who had suffered terrible losses. While the Luftwaffe still held many advantages, the appearance of a fighter that could match their speed and range signaled that the days of German air dominance were numbered. The fight for the skies over Europe was entering a new phase, and the twin-boom Lightning was at the center of it. The P-38 Lightning was unlike any other fighter in the skies over Europe in 1942 and 1943. Its unusual twin-boom design immediately drew attention. At first glance, it was clear this was not a typical single-engine fighter. Its silhouette alone set it apart, with two long tail booms stretching back from the engines and a central cockpit pod connecting them. German pilots who first encountered it were unsure what to think. Some mistook it for a bomber or a cumbersome reconnaissance plane. They quickly learned that appearances were deceiving. Beneath its unusual shape, the Lightning was a purpose-built weapon, engineered to dominate the air with speed, altitude performance, and long-range fighting power. Every line of its design and every component of its construction served a specific role. Each boom of the P-38 held an Allison V1710 engine, one of the most advanced power plants of the time. These engines were fitted with turbo-superchargers, a feature that gave the Lightning exceptional high-altitude performance. At great heights, where the air was thin and other aircraft lost power, the turbo-superchargers forced extra air into the combustion chambers, maintaining speed and thrust. Most fighters of the era, including the formidable German Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190, struggled as they climbed. Their engines lacked the ability to maintain peak performance at the altitudes where bombers typically flew. The P-38 suffered no such limitations. It retained its power well above 20,000 feet and could fight effectively even higher. This gave American pilots a decisive advantage when combat broke out near bomber formations, where German pilots had long relied on their superior climb and dive rates to dictate the fight. The presence of two engines brought more than just extra horsepower. The propellers were set to rotate in opposite directions, a feature known as counter-rotation. In single-engine fighters, propeller torque pulled the aircraft to one side during takeoff or sudden bursts of power, requiring constant correction from the pilot. The Lightning's counter-rotating props canceled out this effect, keeping the plane stable and balanced. This stability was valuable in every stage of flight, during takeoff, in tight combat turns, and when climbing hard to intercept enemy aircraft. It also provided an extra layer of safety. If one engine was hit or failed, the other could often keep the plane in the air. Many pilots credited this design with saving their lives, bringing them home even after taking severe damage. For single-engine fighters, engine failure almost always meant bailing out or crash landing. For the P-38, survival was often still possible. The Lightning was also fast, remarkably so for its size and range. In level flight, it could reach speeds of around 414 miles per hour. At medium and high altitudes, early models of the Bf 109 and FW 190 simply could not keep pace. German pilots were used to setting the terms of engagement. Their usual tactic was to climb above enemy formations, dive in for a swift attack, and then climb away before the defenders could react. Against slower escorts, this method was almost unbeatable. But when they tried it against the Lightning, they were often caught mid-maneuver. The P-38 could follow their dives and match their climbs. In some cases, it could even overtake them. This forced the Luftwaffe to change its approach and abandon some of its tried-and-true tactics. Firepower was another area where the Lightning held a clear edge. Most fighters of the time had their guns mounted in the wings, which meant that the bullets converged at a preset point in front of the plane. Pilots had to estimate the correct distance for their shots to be effective. Too close or too far, and their rounds would miss entirely. The P-38's designers eliminated this problem by mounting all of its weapons in the nose of the central pod. The Lightning carried a single 20mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns, all aligned to fire straight ahead. This created a concentrated, devastating stream of fire. P-38 pilots simply had to point the nose at the target. There was no need to calculate convergence. At close range, a single burst could shred even heavily armored aircraft. This made the Lightning particularly effective in head-on attacks and precision strikes, giving it a reputation as a deadly opponent. One of the P-38's most remarkable qualities was its range. At a time when most fighters were limited to local defense or short escort runs, the Lightning could fly deep into enemy territory. Its large internal fuel tanks, combined with efficient engines, allowed it to accompany bombers to distant targets and back. This was a vital capability during a period when bomber formations were suffering catastrophic losses without adequate escort protection. British Spitfires were fast and agile but lacked the range for long missions. American commanders desperately needed a fighter that could stay with the bombers from start to finish. The P-38 filled that role months before other aircraft, like the P-51 Mustang, were ready for service. German pilots noticed this change almost immediately. They had grown accustomed to planning attacks around the limits of enemy escorts. Once Allied fighters turned back, they could swoop in and attack bombers without resistance. When P-38s began appearing deep over occupied Europe, those tactics no longer worked. Luftwaffe pilots now had to fight their way through escorts even over what had once been safe territory. This not only disrupted their operations but also forced them to engage on terms they had not chosen. Operating at such extended ranges did create challenges for Lightning pilots. Fuel management became critical. Many missions required external drop tanks to extend the plane's reach. In combat, these tanks had to be jettisoned, leaving less fuel for the journey home. Pilots had to balance aggression with caution, deciding how long to fight before breaking off to conserve fuel. A miscalculation could mean running out of fuel over enemy territory. This added layer of complexity made long-range missions especially demanding. The Lightning's handling characteristics were also unique. Its wide wings and twin-boom design provided stability, making it an excellent gunnery platform and a steady flyer on long patrols. However, that same stability reduced its roll rate. In low-altitude turning fights, nimble German fighters could sometimes outmaneuver it. Experienced P-38 pilots learned to avoid these situations. Instead of turning tightly, they used their superior speed and climb to dictate the fight, striking from above and then disengaging before the enemy could counter. When flown to its strengths, the Lightning was a formidable opponent. Another strength of the P-38 was its adaptability. Its roomy nose and sturdy frame allowed for modifications. Some versions carried cameras for reconnaissance, capturing detailed images of enemy positions. Others were equipped with bombs for ground attack missions. This versatility meant that a single type of aircraft could fill multiple roles, giving Allied commanders flexibility in planning operations. Whether as a fighter, bomber escort, scout, or strike platform, the Lightning proved its worth again and again. When the P-38 first appeared over Europe, it was years ahead of most fighters it faced. Its combination of speed, altitude performance, concentrated firepower, and range made it a revolutionary weapon. German pilots who expected slow, vulnerable escorts were forced to rethink their assumptions. The Lightning was not just another Allied fighter. It was a game-changer, one that challenged the Luftwaffe's dominance and began to shift the balance of power in the skies. The first time the Luftwaffe saw the P-38 Lightning in combat, many German pilots thought they were looking at a new kind of bomber. The twin-boom design and wide wingspan gave it a shape unlike anything else in the sky. From a distance, it didn't look like a fast, agile fighter. Some assumed it would be slow and easy prey. That false assumption didn't last long. In late 1942, Allied forces pushed deeper into North Africa. The Luftwaffe operated from well-established airfields and had years of combat experience. Their Bf-109s and Fw-190s had proven themselves against the best Allied fighters and had the upper hand in most battles. The American squadrons flying into the theater were new and untested. Many U.S. pilots were fresh from training, carrying the weight of stories about the Luftwaffe's unmatched skill and deadly tactics. They knew German fighters ruled the skies, and they expected a hard fight. On one mission near Tunisia, a group of P-38s escorted a formation of medium bombers heading toward enemy supply depots. The morning was clear, with the sun hanging low over the desert. The German controllers had seen the raid coming and sent up a mixed group of Bf-109s and FW-190s to intercept. The German pilots climbed high, planning to dive on the bombers, strike fast, and pull away before the escorts could react. This tactic had worked countless times before. They expected it to work again. As the German fighters approached, they spotted the P-38s flying in their unusual formation. The twin tails caught their attention, but most assumed these were slower aircraft, perhaps a new type of light bomber or reconnaissance plane. Confident, they dove in at full speed. The lead German pilot aimed straight for the bomber formation, expecting to scatter the escorts and break through. He did not realize the American fighters could match his speed and climb. The P-38 pilots saw the attack forming and broke formation. Their leader called for a defensive split, sending half the unit up to meet the diving Germans head-on while the others stayed with the bombers. One German fighter went into a sharp dive to escape the first pass, expecting to leave its pursuer behind. Instead, the lightning stayed with him. The American pilot pushed his throttles forward, the turbo-superchargers roaring as the twin engines gave him a burst of speed. The distance closed quickly. The German pilot tried to twist and climb, but the P-38 matched his moves, staying tight on his tail. A short burst from the nose guns ended the chase, and the Bf-109 fell in flames. Elsewhere in the fight, the pattern repeated. German pilots broke off their attacks in confusion. Over the radio, frantic calls went out. "What are these planes? They are too fast. They are right behind me." Some tried to climb out of reach, but the lightnings followed, using their high-altitude power to cut off escape. Others dove steeply, hoping gravity would carry them to safety. In the past, this had always worked. Against the P-38, it didn't. The lightning's stability and speed in a dive were unmatched. American pilots found themselves overtaking their opponents, something they had never experienced in training. The radio chatter on the American side was different. At first, it was tense and uncertain. Many pilots had never seen combat, and the Luftwaffe's reputation weighed heavily on them. The first moments of the battle were chaotic. Then came the realization that their machines were faster, stronger, and more heavily armed. Confidence spread quickly. "Stay on him, you've got him!" one pilot shouted as his wingman lined up a perfect shot. Soon, the Americans were pressing the attack instead of defending against it. The battle over Tunisia lasted only minutes, but it left a lasting impression on both sides. When the German fighters tried to regroup, they found themselves outnumbered and outflanked. The P-38s worked in pairs, using coordinated turns and high-speed passes to break up enemy formations. The concentrated firepower of their nose guns proved devastating. Several German planes were shot down in rapid succession. The survivors broke off and retreated, leaving the bombers to complete their mission with minimal losses. After landing, the American pilots gathered around their aircraft, stunned by what had just happened. Many had expected to barely survive their first encounter with the Luftwaffe. Instead, they had taken the fight to the enemy and won. Mechanics counted the bullet holes and patched damaged wings while intelligence officers took reports. One pilot described how he chased a Bf-109 through a series of climbs and dives, never losing ground. Another spoke about seeing his rounds strike cleanly because of the nose-mounted guns. There was pride, but also disbelief. They had heard of German dominance for so long that it felt unreal to have beaten them in their first major clash. On the German side, the mood was very different. Pilots returned shaken, some barely making it back to base. They spoke of a strange new American fighter that could outclimb and outrun them. Commanders listened carefully. The descriptions didn't match any known Allied aircraft. At first, some dismissed the reports as exaggeration. But the wreckage recovered from the desert told the truth. The Luftwaffe had encountered a new threat, one that required a change in tactics. In the days that followed, German pilots were ordered to be cautious when facing the twin-boom fighter. They were told not to underestimate its speed and to avoid turning engagements where its firepower could be brought to bear. The Luftwaffe, long accustomed to being the hunter, now found itself facing a machine that could hunt them. For the Americans, the battle proved something vital. Their pilots had the skill, and their aircraft had the performance to stand toe-to-toe with the Luftwaffe. What began as fear turned into determination. The P-38 had shown its worth in its very first encounters, and from that day forward, the skies over North Africa would never be the same. When the first P-38 units arrived in Europe, many American pilots were unsure of what to expect. Most had only heard stories of the Luftwaffe's skill and ferocity. They trained hard, but training was nothing like combat. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190 had earned a fearsome reputation. Pilots who faced them often did not return. Many of the young men flying the P-38s wondered if their strange, twin-boom fighter would be enough to keep them alive. On their first missions, doubt sat heavy in the cockpits. They flew high above the Mediterranean, their eyes scanning the horizon. When the German fighters finally appeared, streaking down from above, the Americans braced for the worst. What happened next surprised everyone. The Luftwaffe pilots made their usual diving attacks and then tried to climb back into position. This time, the Americans stayed with them. The Lightning's turbo-supercharged engines roared as the P-38s shot upward, closing the gap. For many American pilots, that moment was life-changing. They realized their aircraft could not only match the enemy's best fighters but sometimes surpass them. One pilot later said, "We had been told to expect the Germans to run rings around us. Instead, we were the ones pressing the attack." The Lightning was fast, stable, and heavily armed. It gave them something they had not felt before: confidence. Famed American ace Richard Bong, who would later become the highest-scoring U.S. fighter pilot of the war, flew the P-38 in the Pacific. Although his victories came later and in a different theater, his words reflected the feelings of many Lightning pilots. Bong once said, "The P-38 was like no other plane. It had power to climb, speed to chase, and enough firepower to finish the job." Thomas Maguire, another top ace, described his first combat missions as a mix of fear and awe. "You knew what the Germans could do," he said. "Then you saw what the Lightning could do. That's when you understood you had a fighting chance." This growing belief in their machine changed how American pilots fought. At first, they were cautious, sticking close to bombers and flying defensive patterns. As they gained experience, they became more aggressive. They learned to use the P-38 speed to climb above enemy formations and strike first. Missions that once felt like suicide runs began to feel like winnable battles. The psychological shift was profound. On the other side, German pilots faced an entirely different set of emotions. At first, they were confused. Many had never seen a twin-engine fighter that could move like the P-38. Early reports described it as a twin-tail bomber escort, suggesting it would be heavy and slow. That assumption cost lives. When the first dogfights ended with German fighters being chased down and destroyed, disbelief spread through Luftwaffe squadrons. One German pilot, after barely escaping a fight over Tunisia, told his comrades, "It climbs like a devil and dives like a stone. I could not shake it." Others echoed his words, warning each other over the radio to avoid direct engagement. In combat reports, Luftwaffe officers noted that the new American fighter had exceptional speed and concentrated firepower. Some pilots even believed they were facing two separate aircraft types at once because they could not understand how a twin-engine machine could be so agile. As more battles were fought, frustration took hold. The Luftwaffe had been used to dictating the terms of combat. They could attack and withdraw at will, confident in their superior performance. The P-38 took that advantage away. German pilots now had to fight on even terms, and many did not like it. Some began demanding better aircraft or new tactics to counter the Lightning. Luftwaffe intelligence scrambled to learn more. They studied wreckage recovered from crash sites, examining the unusual twin-boom layout and nose-mounted guns. Engineers tested captured examples, trying to find weaknesses. Reports were sent to commanders across Europe, warning them to take the new fighter seriously. One intelligence memo described it as a fast, heavily armed escort with unusual range, capable of reaching targets previously beyond enemy fighters. Despite this effort, clear answers were hard to find. The P-38's strengths were obvious, but its pilots were also learning and adapting. The Germans discovered that the Lightning could be vulnerable in tight, low-altitude turning fights where their lighter Bf-109s had an edge. But even knowing this, exploiting it was difficult. Lightning pilots rarely allowed themselves to be drawn into such situations. Instead, they stayed high and fast, using their superior climb and dive to control the fight. The emotional impact on both sides was clear. For American crews, each mission brought more confidence. They began to believe they could win, not just survive. For German pilots, each encounter with the P-38 chipped away at their sense of dominance. The old tactics no longer guaranteed victory. Even experienced veterans felt the strain of fighting an enemy who could match them move for move. In mess halls and briefing rooms, the conversations reflected this change. American pilots shared stories of successful chases and clean kills. They spoke with pride about returning with bombers intact. German pilots, meanwhile, discussed sightings of the twin-tail fighter, trying to piece together a strategy. Some dismissed it as a passing threat, while others feared it signaled a permanent shift in the air war. As the P-38 spread to more units and flew deeper into enemy territory, these reactions only intensified. American pilots felt the tide turning, while German squadrons faced the growing realization that the skies were no longer theirs alone. The human side of the conflict became as important as the machines themselves. In the minds of the men who fought, the P-38 was more than just a fighter. It was a symbol of change, one that inspired hope for some and dread for others. By early 1943, the presence of the P-38 Lightning began to change the air war over Europe and the Mediterranean. Before its arrival, Allied bombers faced terrifying odds on every mission. German fighters would wait for the bombers to appear, strike hard, and disappear before the escorts could react. British Spitfires could provide some cover, but only near the coast or within a limited radius. The Luftwaffe relied on this advantage. They could predict when the escorts would have to turn back and then attack the bombers with impunity. The result was devastating losses for Allied aircrews and stalled bombing campaigns deep inside enemy territory. The P-38 broke that pattern. Its long range allowed it to accompany bombers much farther than any Allied fighter had before. Missions that once meant sending bombers alone now had real escort protection. Lightning pilots could stay with the bombers through most of the mission, meeting German interceptors head-on instead of arriving late to the fight. This immediately forced the Luftwaffe to rethink its tactics. For the first time, they faced enemy fighters over their own airfields and supply routes. The Luftwaffe had built its doctrine around speed and initiative. Their fighters would climb above the bombers, dive in for a quick strike, and then climb back to safety. Against slower escorts, this worked perfectly. Against the Lightning, it was dangerous. The P-38 could climb almost as well as the Bf-109 and dive even better. German pilots who tried the old tactics found themselves pursued and shot down. This forced them to develop new methods, relying on ambushes and coordinated group attacks. Instead of prolonged dogfights, they aimed for quick, decisive strikes before breaking contact. Even with these changes, the Luftwaffe no longer controlled the timing of engagements the way it once had. For the Allies, this shift in control was critical. Bomber crews noticed the difference almost immediately. Before, they had watched helplessly as German fighters tore through their formations. Now they saw P-38s diving into the fight, breaking up attacks and chasing down enemy aircraft. Survival rates began to improve. Crews returned home that might otherwise have been lost. This built morale not only among the bomber groups but across the entire Allied Air Force. Pilots and gunners knew that they had a real chance of completing missions and living to fly another day. In the Mediterranean campaign, the Lightning's impact was felt beyond the airfields. Its long range made it ideal for scouting ahead of advancing ground forces and striking targets far behind enemy lines. Allied commanders used it to disrupt German supply routes, attack troop movements, and gather intelligence. The same fighter that escorted bombers could also carry bombs or cameras, making it a versatile tool in combined operations. As the North African campaign pushed into Tunisia and beyond, the Lightning became a key asset in every stage of the advance. German commanders recognized the threat. They diverted resources to defend vital supply depots and troop concentrations, knowing that P-38s could strike deep without warning. This spread the Luftwaffe thin. Instead of concentrating their strength for major battles, they had to protect a wider area. Every time they engaged the Lightnings, they risked heavy losses. The Luftwaffe still inflicted damage, but the balance of power was shifting. What had been a one-sided fight was becoming a contest of equals, and in some areas, the Allies were beginning to gain the upper hand. The effect of these changes rippled through planning at the highest levels. Before the P-38, Allied leaders had been cautious about deep strikes into occupied Europe. Without fighter protection, these missions were costly and often ineffective. With the Lightning in service, new strategies became possible. Bomber groups could hit targets farther inland and return with fewer losses. This encouraged bolder plans, accelerating the pace of the air war. As P-38 units gained experience, they became more aggressive. Instead of waiting for German fighters to appear, they began hunting them. Fighter sweeps were sent ahead of the bombers, clearing the skies before the main force arrived. This flipped the traditional script of the air war. The Luftwaffe, which had once been the hunter, now found itself reacting to Allied movements. Every engagement drained their strength and sapped their confidence. The Lightning also served as a bridge to future developments. Later in the war, the P-51 Mustang would take over as the premier long-range escort. But in 1942 and 1943, before the Mustang was ready, the P-38 filled that crucial role. Without it, many bomber campaigns might have failed before they began. The Lightning's early success laid the foundation for the broader Allied strategy of sustained, deep penetration raids into German-held territory. In practical terms, this meant more than just planes in the sky. It affected logistics, ground movements, and political decisions. Allied advances in Italy and beyond were supported by the pressure the P-38 exerted on enemy supply lines. When German units could not move freely by rail or road, their ability to resist ground offensives weakened. This synergy between air power and ground operations sped up the overall campaign. The Luftwaffe, once seen as an unbeatable force, began to show cracks. Their pilots were still skilled and their machines still formidable, but they could no longer count on having the better position or the faster aircraft. Each time they clashed with P-38s, they risked losing experienced men and valuable aircraft. The German command faced a difficult choice: concentrate their fighters to challenge the Lightnings directly or spread them out to defend key areas. Either option carried heavy costs. The arrival of the P-38 did not win the war by itself, but it changed the trajectory of the conflict in the air. It allowed missions that had been impossible months earlier and gave Allied commanders the tools to apply constant pressure. It disrupted German tactics and forced them into a defensive stance. Most importantly, it gave Allied aircrews the protection and reach they needed to carry the fight deeper into enemy territory and set the stage for future victories. As the war moved forward and newer aircraft entered service, the P-38 Lightning remained a key part of Allied operations. Its design left a lasting mark on how fighters were built and how air campaigns were planned. Before the Lightning, few believed a fighter could combine long-range, high-speed, and heavy firepower in one package. The P-38 proved it was possible, and its success pushed aircraft designers to think differently about what a frontline fighter could do. The Lightning's twin-engine layout gave it strengths that single-engine fighters lacked. It showed that a fighter could travel vast distances without sacrificing speed or combat performance. This was critical at a time when the Allies needed to strike targets deep inside enemy territory. The lessons learned from these missions shaped the development of later aircraft. Engineers and planners took note of how the P-38 allowed bomber formations to reach distant objectives while staying protected. This directly influenced the design of fighters like the P-51 Mustang, which was built with range and escort duty in mind. The Mustang eventually became the standard long-range escort fighter, but the Lightning proved the concept first. The P-38 also influenced tactics. Pilots and commanders developed new strategies based on its unique capabilities. They learned to use speed and altitude to gain an advantage, hitting enemy formations from above and then disengaging before the fight turned into a slow-turning battle. These tactics were later adopted across Allied air forces, becoming standard practice for long-range escorts. Even after the war, air forces around the world studied these methods. The Lightning helped shape modern ideas about how to control airspace and protect strike missions. Its role in multiple missions demonstrated its versatility. The same plane that fought German fighters could carry bombs, conduct reconnaissance, or attack ground targets. Reconnaissance versions of the P-38 flew deep behind enemy lines, bringing back valuable intelligence that shaped Allied planning. Few aircraft of the war could match that kind of flexibility. This adaptability made the Lightning a valuable asset well beyond its role as a pure fighter. In many campaigns, commanders relied on it not just for combat but for gathering information and supporting ground troops. This multi-role approach became a model for future fighter designs. Among pilots, the P-38 built a strong reputation. Men who flew it respected its power and reliability. They trusted it to bring them home even after long missions or heavy combat damage. Many pilots credited its twin engines with saving their lives. If one engine failed or was hit, the other often kept running, allowing a safe return. This reliability gave crews confidence on missions where failure meant capture or death. Over time, the Lightning became known as a dependable workhorse, one that could be counted on in any situation. German pilots remembered it for different reasons. In their reports, they described the shock of facing a fighter that was faster than they expected and able to match their own top aircraft. Some Luftwaffe veterans admitted later that the first encounters with the P-38 forced them to rethink their tactics and even their sense of superiority. For years, the Luftwaffe had controlled the air with little challenge. The arrival of the Lightning was one of the first signs that their dominance was slipping. In this way, the P-38 became part of the larger story of how the balance of air power shifted during the war. As the years passed, the Lightning's story spread beyond the men who flew it. Film crews captured footage of its missions, and wartime photographers documented its unique shape on airfields and in combat. After the war, this material appeared in documentaries and newsreels, keeping the memory of the aircraft alive for future generations. Museums preserved surviving examples, and veterans shared their stories with historians and the public. These efforts ensured that the P-38 would not be forgotten. The aircraft's distinctive twin-boom design made it instantly recognizable. Even decades later, people could identify it at a glance. Aviation enthusiasts and historians continue to study its features and performance. Its speed, range, and firepower still impress, even compared to later fighters. Air shows often feature restored Lightnings, their engines roaring as they perform for crowds who have only read about their wartime service. Seeing one in flight connects the modern audience to the pilots who once relied on the plane in life-and-death situations. In popular culture, the P-38 appears in films, books, and art focused on the Second World War. Its image represents a moment when the Allies began to challenge German control of the skies. Veterans' stories often highlight that moment of change. Some recall the fear of their first missions, others the relief of seeing P-38 escorts appear alongside their bombers. These personal accounts give depth to the historical record, showing not just the technical achievements of the aircraft but its human impact. The Lightning's service in both Europe and the Pacific gave it a broad legacy. It fought in nearly every type of mission imaginable, from escorting bombers over Germany to island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific. This wide-ranging service meant that countless airmen, from pilots to mechanics, interacted with it and formed their own stories about its role. Those stories have been passed down through families and communities, keeping the memory of the plane alive long after the war ended. Today, historians view the P-38 as one of the most important fighters of the war. It was not perfect, and it faced challenges and limitations, but its contributions were undeniable. It changed how the Allies fought and how they thought about air power. The twin-boom fighter that once shocked the Luftwaffe continues to stand as a symbol of innovation and determination, preserved not just in museums, but in the collective memory of those who study and honor the history of the Second World War.